A quarter of a century ago, the man running Microsoft stood on stage in front of the entire tech industry and labeled Linux a cancer. He didn't call it a rival. He didn't call it a challenge worth respecting. He called it a disease, something rotten that had to be quarantined and stamped out before it spread any further. For years afterward, the company backed that rhetoric with action. It chased patent licensing arrangements that put a legal shadow over Linux distributions. It leaned hard on its own proprietary server products, presenting them as the only sensible choice for serious enterprises. It wove Windows so deeply into the fabric of computing that picturing any other system running the world's critical infrastructure felt almost like a fantasy. Then, in June of 2026, at its own developer conference, Microsoft handed the public a Linux distribution with its own name stamped on the box. Sit with that for a second. Microsoft built a Linux distribution. Microsoft maintains it. It costs nothing to download. The code is open, and the company that once compared this operating system to a tumor is now the one shipping it. Tech journalists reacted the way they always do to a plot twist this dramatic, with astonishment, applause, and a stack of think pieces marveling at just how far the company has come. What most of that coverage skipped over was something far more important than a feel-good redemption arc. Nobody was asking, clearly and without sentiment, what Microsoft had actually built, who it was actually built for, what it actually does day to day, and what's actually motivating the company to build it in the first place. Because once you ask those questions honestly, the tidy comeback story starts to look a lot messier. That's what this is, the messier version. Start with what's real, because the space between the headline and the substance here is wider than most people assume. Azure Linux 4.0 is a genuine functioning Linux distribution. It's built on an actual Linux kernel, a hardened build of kernel version 6.18 LTS. Package management runs through DNF5, a from-scratch rewrite in C++, designed to be quicker and leaner than the tool it replaces. The whole thing is rooted in Fedora Linux, meaning Microsoft is drawing packages from Fedora's upstream project and layering its own curation, patches, and policy on top of that foundation. Under the hood, you'll find glibc 2.42, System 258, a build of Python 3.14 with a JIT compilation baked in, and OpenSSL 3.5, equipped with post-quantum cryptographic support. None of that is throwaway or half-finished. These are the choices of engineers who understand modern infrastructure and built something meant to be taken seriously. The timeline moved fast. The project was formally unveiled on May 18, 2026, during the Open Source Summit for North America. It reached public preview status on June 2, 2026, at Microsoft's Build Conference. Right now, you can run it on Azure virtual machines, on Azure VM scale sets, or grab an ISO and install it on bare metal to kick the tires yourself. A version built for WSL is on the way too, which will let Windows-based developers run the exact same distribution locally on their own machines. Here's where the narrative and the reality start pulling apart. There is no desktop in Azure Linux 4.0, none whatsoever, no window manager, no graphical shell, no audio subsystem. The stripped-down base image doesn't even include something as basic as a terminal pager, the small utility that lets you scroll through long command output a screen at a time. Reviewers over at How To Geek, who actually put it through its paces, found that the installer makes creating a user account an optional step, one that's easy to overlook entirely. Skip it, and you're locked out after installation with no way to log back in. Root login is switched off by default. There's no graphical installer walking you through setup. Everything happens at a command prompt. If you've spent time wrestling with something like Slackware, Gentoo, or Arch, none of this will faze you. If you've never opened a terminal in your life, this distribution will feel like slamming into a brick wall, but painting it that way undersells the point, because Azure Linux 4.0 was never meant for someone who's never touched a command line. It exists for cloud engineers spinning up workloads on Azure. It exists for the people managing Kubernetes clusters at scale. It exists for infrastructure teams inside big enterprises who want a lean, security-hardened base image that plugs directly into Azure's management tooling. For that audience, the missing desktop environment and the absent graphical wizard aren't shortcomings. They're the whole design philosophy. Every package you don't install is one less avenue for an attacker to exploit. A server that can't do everything is a server that's harder to break. So yes, the headline practically writes itself. Microsoft ships Linux, but the actual story is narrower, more specific, and in some ways more unsettling, depending on how you look at it. To really understand why Microsoft built this thing, you have to trace where it came from. And that history is anything but a straight line. It also tells you a lot about how Microsoft actually relates to Linux behind the scenes. The project that eventually became Azure Linux 4.0 was born quietly inside Microsoft back in September of 2019 with no public name attached. It surfaced on GitHub in November 2020 under the label CBL-Mariner. CBL standing for Common Base Linux, part of a family of internal builds named after Seattle neighborhoods. One sibling, Delridge DOS, was Debian-based and briefly powered Azure Cloud Shell before quietly getting phased out in late 2022. The other Mariner was RPM-based, assembled from scratch using specification files borrowed from Photon OS, Fedora, and the Linux from Scratch project. Mariner is the one that stuck around. It ended up running the container. Hosts behind Azure Kubernetes Service. It became the foundation of WSLG, the piece of WSL that allows Linux graphical applications to run inside Windows. And it quietly became the backbone running huge chunks of Microsoft's own Azure infrastructure, unseen by most customers. By 2023, the company had rebranded CBL-Mariner as Azure Linux, giving it a clearer identity and tighter branding. What changed? At Build 2026 is that, for the very first time, any customer can deploy it on any Azure VM, not merely encounter it invisibly as the hidden layer under a managed Kubernetes service. That's the actual news here. A shift from background plumbing to a platform customers can consciously choose. Microsoft didn't just discover Linux this year. It's been running on Linux internally for a long time. What's new is that the company is finally putting it in front of customers and inviting them to pick it deliberately, rather than absorbing it invisibly through some managed offering. And the scale at which Microsoft already leans on Linux internally is worth pausing on. More than 2 out of every 3 customer compute cores running on Azure are already running Linux, not Windows. ChatGPT, arguably one of the most computationally hungry pieces of software ever built, spans more than 10 million compute cores, every one of them running Linux. LinkedIn, a Microsoft-owned company, runs enormous workloads on Azure Linux. Databricks, one of the largest cloud-based data and AI platforms out there, has shifted massive amounts of infrastructure onto Azure Linux as well. The same company that spent the early 2000s treating Linux like a disease has quietly built the most successful commercial cloud platform in the world, largely on top of it. None of this is mysterious. Linux simply performs better for server workloads, and it has for decades. It's leaner, more configurable, holds up better under heavy load, cheaper to license, and better served by the open source tooling that modern software teams depend on. Microsoft understood all of this. Bringing Linux into its infrastructure wasn't some ideological shift. It was a competitive necessity. The alternative was running a weaker platform and bleeding customers to AWS and Google Cloud, both of which had been Linux native from day one. Which leads to the real question, why does Azure Linux 4.0 matter? And why is it more complicated than it looks? Start with a fair technical criticism, one the community picked up on almost instantly. Even though Microsoft billed this as a general-purpose Linux distribution for Azure, the documentation available at launch still leaned heavily toward container hosting, Kubernetes quick start guides, and AKS-C specific scenarios. Someone on Hacker News made the point bluntly. Despite the marketing language calling it a general-purpose Azure OS, the actual product documentation still refers to it as the Microsoft Azure Linux Container Host, Microsoft's own product. Team acknowledged the gap openly, noting that the story around running it on VMs is much newer than the story around AKS, and that documentation would catch up as preview access widened. That's a reasonably honest admission, but it still creates a real headache for anyone trying to seriously evaluate the product today. A gap this visible between the marketing pitch and the actual docs is exactly the kind of thing that makes seasoned Linux administrators raise an eyebrow. The support model raises its own legitimate concerns. Microsoft only offers formal service level agreements and official technical support for instances running inside Azure. Deploy it on your own hardware, on a competing cloud, or in an on-premises data center, and you're on your own relying on community channels instead of Microsoft's support desk. A company spokesperson said as much directly. Support is centered on cloud-based use cases. There's nothing deceptive about that. Microsoft isn't hiding it. But it does mean Azure Linux 4.0 isn't a general-purpose distribution. In the way Ubuntu, Fedora, or Debian are, it's an Azure-first product that happens to be installable elsewhere, but genuinely fully supported in exactly one place, Microsoft's own cloud. Then there's the FIPS 143 certification wrinkle, which adds yet another layer of nuance. FIPS 143 is the federal cryptographic standard required across government systems, financial institutions, and healthcare infrastructure. It's not a nice to have in those industries. It's a hard requirement. At the time this shipped into public preview, that certification for Azure Linux 4.0 was still pending, and it wouldn't be finalized until general availability for the exact organizations that need it most, regulated industries trying to consolidate onto a single operating system across their cloud footprint. Azure Linux 4.0 simply isn't a drop-in replacement yet. Microsoft says it expects to close that gap before general availability arrives later in 2026, and there's no strong reason to doubt that. But it means the product launched with an incomplete answer in precisely the area its most demanding customers care about most. Now, here's the part that deserves the closest attention, because it moves past technical nitpicks and into the strategic logic behind the whole project. Logic that matters to anyone running software on Azure, whether or not they ever touch this distribution directly. Azure Linux 4.0 isn't, at its core, a gift to the open source world. It's a fleet control strategy. With more than 2/3 of Azure's customer compute already running Linux, and that share only growing as AI workloads multiply across the cloud, the operating system stops being a background detail and becomes something that matters enormously at scale. Microsoft's AI infrastructure, the massive clusters training and serving large language models, the inference fleets, powering products like Copilot, all of it runs at a size where the OS layer is anything but a commodity. Kernel versions, GPU driver behavior, container runtime quirks, patch cadence, boot times, memory management policy, every one of these lives inside the operating system, and every one of them shapes performance and cost at scale. For years, Microsoft has had to juggle all of that across a patchwork of operating systems. Different versions of Ubuntu, Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, SUSE, Debian, and whatever else customers brought along or picked from the Azure marketplace. Every additional OS version multiplies the burden of patching vulnerabilities, hardening images, proving compliance, responding to incidents, and planning life cycles. For a company managing security across a cloud platform at Microsoft's scale, that kind of fragmentation is a genuine ongoing headache. Azure Linux 4.0 solves that headache from Microsoft's point of view. If customers can be nudged towards standardizing on a Microsoft-built Linux baseline, Microsoft gains a degree of control over the deepest layers of Azure workloads that it has never had before. It can tune the kernel specifically for its own hardware. It can bake its own security tooling straight into the OS layer. It can dictate the update lifecycle around its own service timelines. It can fine-tune container performance for its own Kubernetes stack. Customers walk away with simplicity and tight integration. Microsoft walks away with alignment, leverage, and command over a layer of the stack that has, for the entirety of Azure's existence, been partly outside its grip. An analysis from Windows Forum captured this well. Whichever cloud provider controls the hardware, the hypervisor, the host images, the guest agents, the container, hosts, the Kubernetes services, the observability tooling, the identity systems, and the patch pipelines has more freedom to optimize and fewer places for blame to land elsewhere. Adding the guest operating system to that already long list of controlled layers isn't a neutral engineering choice. It's a calculated strategic move. The parallel to Amazon and Google is instructive. Amazon Linux, now on version 2023, is the default recommended OS for EC2 instances and ECS container hosts. Google's container-optimized OS runs the nodes behind Google Kubernetes Engine. Both companies made this exact move years before Microsoft did, and both have wrestled with the same underlying tension. Steering customers toward a first-party OS doesn't reduce lock-in. It deepens it, just more subtly than a contract ever could. Amazon Linux performs best on AWS. Google's container-optimized OS is purpose-built for GKE. And by Microsoft's own admission, Azure Linux is supported specifically for cloud-based scenarios, which, in plain terms, means Azure and Azure alone. Microsoft was actually the last of the three major cloud providers to release a general-purpose, server-focused Linux distribution of its own. Notably, it chose to build on top of Fedora, rather than construct something from the ground up the way Amazon did. A deliberate decision that signals a preference for working alongside the existing open source community rather than going it alone in a proprietary silo. That distinction matters. Microsoft isn't inventing an isolated, incompatible Linux variant. It's building close to Fedora, which means system administrators already comfortable with Fedora's RPM ecosystem and tooling will find plenty that feels familiar here. The DNF5 package manager, the RPM package format, the command line conventions, none of it is alien. It reads like Fedora with an Azure-specific layer applied on top. But the messaging trap embedded in all of this is real and worth naming directly. Azure Linux 4.0 is not Fedora. It's derived from Fedora, but it isn't Fedora itself. The package selection is curated by Microsoft. Support flows through Microsoft. The update schedule follows Microsoft's own priorities. The modifications are made by Microsoft's own engineers. If something changes upstream in Fedora that creates friction for Azure Linux, it's Microsoft that decides how to respond. Not the Fedora community, not you. Using it means placing your trust in Microsoft's curation, Microsoft's priorities, and Microsoft's timetable. For plenty of organizations and plenty of situations, that trade-off is entirely reasonable. But for others, especially those who deliberately chose open source tools, specifically to avoid depending on any single vendor's roadmap, this reintroduces exactly the kind of dependency they were trying to escape in the first place. Nobody can say with any confidence right now what this means for Microsoft's long-running partnerships with Canonical, Red Hat, and SUSE. All three companies already sell optimized Linux images on Azure. All three maintain substantial, mutually profitable commercial relationships with Microsoft. Red Hat Enterprise Linux on Azure is a major offering in its own right, with dedicated support tiers, certified configurations, and a loyal customer base that's relied on it for years. Ubuntu on Azure occupies similar territory, with its own optimizations, its own enterprise support agreements, and customers who specifically chose it because of Canonical's long-term support promises. Publicly, Microsoft insists it plans to keep nurturing those partnerships. It frames Azure Linux 4.0 as a specialized tool built for container hosts and cloud-native workloads, not a wholesale replacement for the enterprise Linux products its partners already sell. That framing might well be sincere. It might also just be the framing that avoids spooking partner relationships, while Azure Linux is still building up enough of a customer base to stand on its own. Honestly, nobody outside Microsoft's own walls knows which of those it really is, and it's entirely possible both are true at once. What is clear is that having a first-party operating system in the mix changes the competitive dynamics in a way that didn't exist before, and how that plays out will unfold over years, not months. For the engineers and administrators actually trying to figure out what any of this means for their own day-to-day work, the practical question is simpler. What is Azure Linux 4.0? Actually good for right now, and what should you avoid using it for? If your organization already runs heavily on Azure, leans on containerized workloads through Kubernetes, and wants a lean, hardened, Microsoft-backed base OS that plugs cleanly into Azure's management surface, this is genuinely worth evaluating in its current public preview state. The engineering underneath it is solid. The Fedora-derived package ecosystem is modern and familiar to anyone comfortable with RPM-based systems. The security posture is legitimately strong. On the other hand, if you're running a multi-cloud setup, if FIPS compliance is a non-negotiable requirement today, if you need the same level of support on bare metal or another cloud provider that you'd get on Azure, or if your workloads depend on software outside Microsoft's curated package set, this distribution isn't the right fit yet. That could change as the product matures and the documentation finally catches up with the marketing. But right now, it's a public preview of a strong cloud-native server OS, excellent within its intended lane and limited pretty much everywhere outside it. The story Microsoft wants people to walk away with is the redemption arc. The company that once branded Linux a cancer now ships its own version of it, proof that the arc of history really does bend toward openness. That narrative isn't false, exactly. Microsoft's relationship with Linux really has changed dramatically over the past 25 years, and Azure Linux 4.0 is a tangible product of that shift. The engineers behind it clearly know their craft, and the technical decisions baked into the distribution reflect genuine, serious engagement with the broader Linux ecosystem. But the explanation for why Microsoft actually built this is different from the explanation the company would prefer you internalize. They built it because more than 2/3 of their cloud already runs on Linux, and they wanted an OS layer they fully controlled. They built it because Amazon and Google both already had first-party Linux distributions, and Microsoft didn't. And that gap was becoming uncomfortable as AI workloads multiplied and fleet management complexity kept climbing. They built it because owning the base operating system layer of your own cloud platform carries value that has nothing to do with sentimental feelings about operating systems and everything to do with control. None of that makes Azure Linux 4.0 bad software. It isn't. It just makes it something more layered and more worth understanding than either the celebratory version of the story or the cynical version could capture on its own. Microsoft really did launch its own Linux distribution. It's real, it's running in production at genuine scale, and it's technically serious engineering. It is also, first and foremost, designed to serve Microsoft's cloud business. Both of those things are simultaneously true, and the space between the headline and the fuller picture is exactly the gap this whole piece has been trying to close. Understanding that gap also means paying attention to how the Linux community itself actually reacted to this announcement, because the response was more layered than either the applause or the suspicion that dominated the surface-level coverage. People who've spent years watching Microsoft's relationship with open source evolve tend to split into two camps here. The first camp points to the full 25-year arc as real evidence of a genuine cultural shift. Azure Linux isn't just a marketing stunt dressed up as a Linux distribution. Its GitHub repository is full of real commits from real engineers making real technical decisions. The collaboration with Fedora's upstream is authentic. The kernel is actively maintained and updated. The security engineering behind it is substantial. Microsoft has, in fact, been contributing to the Linux kernel itself for years now. Driver code, security patches, and other contributions that genuinely benefit the wider ecosystem, not just Microsoft's own products. The people building this distribution aren't faking an interest in Linux. They care about it because their jobs depend on it working well. The second camp, echoed by a comment referencing the old embrace, extend, extinguish framework, sees something else at play. That phrase describes the strategy. Microsoft was accused of running during the browser wars of the late 1990s. Adopt a widely used standard, bolt on proprietary extensions that create dependency, then use that dependency to slowly push the open standard aside in favor of a version you fully control. The worry here isn't that Microsoft will suddenly change the license terms or lock the code away. It's subtler than that. The fear is that by making Azure Linux the most convenient, best integrated, most thoroughly supported Linux option on the most widely used commercial cloud platform, Microsoft could gradually pull the center of gravity of enterprise Linux away from independent distributions and toward one it controls. Not through trickery, but through sheer convenience, the ordinary tendency of organizations to standardize on whatever their primary vendor happens to offer. Whether that concern is prophetic or overblown really depends on how much weight you put on the last decade of Microsoft's behavior versus the 3 decades before it, and reasonable people land in different places on that question. What isn't up for debate is that Microsoft now has the capability to pursue that outcome, whether or not that's the actual intention. The capability exists. The distribution exists. The customer relationships exist. The cloud scale to make it matter exists. What comes next hinges on decisions Microsoft hasn't made yet, and quite possibly decisions nobody inside the company has fully worked out yet either. There's another dimension worth pulling apart here: the timing of the Azure Container Linux announcement alongside Azure Linux 4.0. Azure Container Linux is an immutable, container-optimized host built on top of Flatcar Container Linux. Immutable means the OS ships as a read-only image. You can't install packages on it, tweak its settings, or modify it while it's running. Whenever an update rolls out, the entire image is swapped for a fresh one automatically, with automatic rollback built in if anything goes wrong. That model is genuinely excellent for security and consistency at scale. No configuration drift, no mystery servers accumulating undocumented manual tweaks over the years, no uncertainty about what's actually running on any given node in a cluster. But immutability cuts both ways. It also means the operating system is essentially a black box from the customer's vantage point. You don't customize it, you don't tune it, you run your containers on top of it and accept whatever's baked into the image. And the entity deciding what goes into that image, which packages, which kernel settings, which security policies, is Microsoft. For regulated industries and security-focused organizations, that kind of locked-down, immutable baseline is genuinely appealing. It eliminates an entire category of operational headaches. But it also eliminates an entire category of control. You're trusting Microsoft's image instead of assembling your own environment from scratch. Put those two products together. Azure Linux 4.0 for immutable virtual machine workloads and Azure Container Linux for immutable container hosts, and you get what Microsoft is calling a full Linux platform family. One Microsoft-built family with different members tailored to different workloads. The architecture makes sense, and there's a sound technical rationale for keeping the two separate. But the strategic upshot is that Microsoft now has a credible ready-made answer for essentially every server-side Linux use case on Azure. And that answer is a Microsoft-controlled distribution, running on Microsoft-defined support terms, tuned according to Microsoft's own performance priorities. That's the part of this story that's genuinely bigger than the headline. It's not that Microsoft released a Linux distribution in 2026. It's that Microsoft has now assembled a complete, production-grade, credibly competitive Linux platform for the cloud at precisely the moment when AI workloads are exploding demand for cloud computing capacity. The next few years are going to see a staggering amount of new infrastructure deployed just to train and serve AI models. All of that infrastructure needs an operating system underneath it. Microsoft now has one ready to offer, and it's built specifically to tie that infrastructure as tightly as possible to the broader Azure ecosystem. Whether all of this ultimately benefits or harms the wider Linux world hinges on whether Microsoft's current posture, upstream collaboration, genuine open source contribution, holds up as the commercial stakes keep climbing. Looking at the last decade, there's real reason for cautious optimism. Looking at the 3 decades before that, there's real reason to stay watchful. Probably the most honest stance is to hold both of those at once. Use the software where it genuinely solves a problem you have, and keep a close eye on what Microsoft does with the leverage it's now building for itself. There's one more piece of this that almost nobody covered, and it might be the quietest but most significant detail in the whole announcement. Azure Linux 4.0 is coming to WSL. Microsoft has confirmed this is on its roadmap. Soon, a developer working on a Windows machine will be able to open a WSL terminal running Azure Linux, the very same distribution running in Azure's production environments, and work in conditions that genuinely mirror what their code will encounter once it's deployed. Not something similar. The literal same distribution, same kernel, same package set. The impact on day-to-day development work is real. The mismatch between a developer's local machine and the production environment. Their code eventually runs in as one of the oldest, most expensive sources of bugs in the entire software industry. Code that runs perfectly on a laptop and then breaks in production because the environments quietly diverged in ways nobody anticipated. Running Azure Linux through WSL closes a meaningful chunk of that gap more cleanly than any previous setup has managed. It won't close it entirely. WSL still runs inside Windows and hardware level. Differences still matter for certain kinds of workloads. But for the typical application development workflow, the consistency gain is substantial and genuinely useful. Of course, that convenience is also just another expression of the same lock-in dynamic running through this entire story. If your development environment, your CI/CD pipelines, your staging setup, and your production infrastructure are all running the same Azure-controlled distribution, the cost of ever leaving Azure grows a little with every additional layer built on top of it. That's not accidental. It's the same architecture of vendor alignment every major cloud provider has been quietly building toward for years. AWS has its version of this story. Google has its version too, but Microsoft now has its own version, and it's considerably more complete than it was even 6 months earlier. So here's where all of this actually lands. Microsoft has launched a genuine Linux distribution, technically serious software built by capable engineers, resting on a solid foundation. It's purpose-built for cloud and server workloads, has no desktop environment of any kind, and is only fully supported when it's running on Azure itself. It's one piece of a broader strategy aimed at controlling the base operating system layer of Azure's cloud at exactly the moment that layer matters more than it ever has before. The redemption story wrapped around Microsoft and Linux is real, but it exists alongside a strategic self-interest that's just as self-serving as every major platform decision made by every major technology company tends to be. Azure Linux is genuinely good software. Just go in with your eyes open about what it actually is, who built it, and why they built it. That's the fuller, more honest version of the story.